I'm still here. I'll just turn my screen around for a second, just sort something out.
Okay.
I'm still here.
You can turn. Do you want to? Do you know how to turn your microphone off for a little bit?
If I know how to do that, yeah.
Okay. All right.
It's all right, I'm not making it. So whatever.
Okay. So we were talking about the review that we did. I put a rapid in inverted commas because it was anything but rapid, as anybody who's ever done a rapid review might know. But essentially, what we were looking at with this review of the literature was we were trying to explore what the recent literature said about the barriers and facilitators, including seldom heard groups. And it was any seldom heard group. It wasn't just people with learning disabilities or autistic people in research related to health and social care. So we were looking at any seldom heard group. And after going through kind of the full process, we ended up with 83 studies published between 2001 and 2011. And just under half of these papers related to people with learning disabilities, interestingly. So almost, you know, sort of half of those papers were specifically looking at the difficulties or what was needed to include people with learning disabilities in research as participants. Okay. And what we did was that we looked, obviously we analyzed and looked across all of the papers at the reasons why people's views and experiences are sometimes not represented in research. And we found three core areas. They were assumptions in design, made in designs, process, definition and recruitment, which I'll say a little bit about, and population characteristics. So I'll say very briefly a little bit about each of those, and then we'll pause for a few minutes if there's any questions, and then we'll go on to the next bit. So assumptions in design. So this was fairly straightforward. It was that researchers made assumptions at the point of designing the study, which led them to choose methods that excluded particular groups. So for example, very commonly, they chose interviews or questionnaires with relatively complex structures, which meant that people with communication difficulties and people who found it difficult to read and write couldn't be involved in the project. Sometimes researchers made decisions at the beginning about who would and wouldn't be included. So it wasn't as a result of choosing a particular type of methodology, but it was a result of they actually made a decision. And we find that frequently this was associated with requirements for ethical approval and gaining consent. So people often talked about only working with those who could give informed consent, because actually it required a different ethical procedure. It required, you know, going through a different ethics committee. It was more complex if you had to do that, and the difficulty of gaining consent and the amount of work it would take to get informed consent, or to get, as we moved into the using the Mental Capacity Act, to get consultee agreement, etc. So those were actually very commonly highlighted as barriers to people, particularly people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but also, for example, sometimes people with dementia would be left out because of the difficulties it would cause the research team to do that. Now, it's really interesting because that's the study we did in 2012 or 11 and 12 actually replicated pretty much. There was nothing new came out of that study than all of the research from the 80s and the 90s, in particular in terms of involving people with with learning disabilities. So there was a lot of research before in the 80s about involving people in research, and between 2001 and 2011, we learned nothing new about involving people. It was all stuff that was already known. And as I did in preparation for today, I did just a quick check. And again, there's very little new. There's a few things which I'll mention towards the end that are reassuring. In terms of defining and recruiting seldom heard groups, obviously there's a key issue that none of these groups that we were thinking about, in particular people with learning disabilities and those who are autistic, are homogenous groups. In other words, there's lots of differences between the people within those groups and actually different elements of, or different groups with subgroups within those groups might need very different strategies for involvement. You know, what might work, and even we were also looking at minority groups, we were looking at gender, we were looking at all sorts of groups, and even within, you know, when we were looking at involving people from minority ethnic groups, each of those groups, different recruitment processes worked better, for example, than in others. Some groups were less like, it was easier to recruit those who access health and social care services, obviously. It was easier to find them in the first place. But some groups were less likely to use services, and we already knew that. For example, those from ethnic minority groups, and particularly those who were a member of more than one group. So those from ethnic minority groups who also had a learning disability are much less likely to be accessing services, for example. Those with milder learning disabilities, those with physical disabilities living with their family, those who were homeless, and those from traveling communities were all much less likely to use services and therefore less likely to be found for research. Interestingly, some people did not see themselves as part of the target group or see the benefit of participating. So they didn't recognize, they might have received the information letter and going, I don't have a disability. Why am I being sent this, kind of thing? The other thing that particularly affected people with intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, and autism was that services would act as kind of gatekeepers. It was often services that you had to go through to contact people, and sometimes would even make decisions about whether people can or would want to participate in research without actually asking people. Most research, a convenience sample was used, so just basically who they could find within that group, usually maybe associated with an existing community group or an advocacy group or an existing group of people. And that often meant that there wasn't necessarily representative of the population, and some groups were often over-researched, for example. And then the final thing that we discovered that was a problem with recruiting was lack of trust of the individual or the institution doing the research. Yeah, people didn't, you know, they didn't trust either the institution, the university, or whatever it was that was doing the research, and therefore they were less likely to take part or to agree to take part. And then there was this element of the characteristics of specific populations. So there were some things that were particularly important at recruitment stage, such as language and cultural differences, cognitive difficulties or difficulties with communication, and the presence of physical or sensory difficulties, or, oh dear, I apologize, that's an unfinished sentence. I must have jumped back and forwards in that one. But differences where, such as, so for example, autism, for example, was one of the issues. The other thing that studies found was failure to adapt materials and methods to the needs of the participants throughout the research pathway. So not always using things that were accessible for individuals. The use of particular types of methods or even question formats. For example, we know that certain question formats are particularly difficult for people who have any form of a learning disability. Asking questions about when things happened or how long things happened for can be very hard, not for everybody, but for many people. Lack of sufficient time and resources for people to be involved at different parts of the research pathway, and also even the accessibility of the research environment, right down to the fact that somebody with a wheelchair couldn't get in to the university building where they were holding the research, or the place where they were holding the research. Yeah. In that sense. Okay, so the solutions from the review won't surprise you. I suspect. But obviously one of the recommendations, one of the group of studies, was that it's important to include people from the group you would like to include in the research right from the start. So in the design process and in testing measures, letters, interview schedules, etc. Allowing additional time and increased flexibility at each stage of the research. And this was identified directly in 54 of the 83 papers that we reviewed. And generally this requires more resources, people resources, money resources, and time resources. Using multiple recruitment strategies, in particular, including face-to-face contact with potential participants if possible. So allowing people to meet the researchers, research team, ask questions, and then decide if they wanted to participate was often really helpful for helping people to establish maybe a little bit of trust and to take part. Yeah. And of course, ensuring recruitment materials are accessible in many different ways. And for example, we've used things like presenting information in video format about the project. And I'll show you some other examples with Alan in a minute. And then the flexibility in methodology. Triangulation of data collection methods and adapting tools to be acceptable, measurement tools to be accessible was often identified as needed. And then, although much debated in the literature, yeah, the use of proxy responses was identified as one way of at least getting the experiences and the potential views of people heard within the research field. So asking other people about the individual's lives and the sorts of things that they like or that they do, etc. And so those were kind of identified. Now, one thing just to, what we didn't come across as much then as we would now is this issue of, it's not really a newer issue. Terminology has always been an issue. Well, how do we refer to the group that we want to include in research, that we're trying to target effectively in terms of involvement in the research? But particularly in the field of learning disability and autism, the issue of terminology has become a big issue. So for example, disorder, do we use person first or identity first language? And for learning disabilities, the general view is that we should use person first, a person with a learning disability. However, for the autistic population, notice I've used autistic, the identity first has been identified as the preferred option for many people, but by no means all people, even all people who are themselves autistic. So you might need to use different terms for different people involved. You might need to justify the term you are using. Our approach is use the term people ask you to use and change it when they ask you to change it, as a general rule. Usually it really helps if when you first consult people about the research, that you ask them, what terminology do you think we should use? What terms should we use? And then you can say that the terminology that we're using in the research has been decided by our steering group or our advisory group of people, for example. And we can always just recognize that not everybody uses the same terminology. Yeah. And actually there's a sense of reality that you can only do your best. Unfortunately, there is a huge variability in what people, kind of say and what people prefer. Just very briefly, because I want to make sure we get to Alan's stuff in a second. I've just realized the time, but so other things that can really involve the impact on the involvement of people with learning disabilities and autistic people have been communication difficulties and differences. For example, things like for autistic people, sometimes they have the issue of literal understanding. So being able to understand things that may not be expressed in language that can be understood literally can make it really hard for people to get the hang of what they're supposed to, what the research is about, etc. The processing speed issues mean that people often need longer to take part, to answer questions, to do things. The need for structure and predictability, knowing exactly what's expected of you, for example. The ability to think about the future and take other people's perspectives can be an issue. The ability to compare different situations, the anxiety and fear of the unknown or of change, all of those things can be issues. Unwilling or afraid to criticize. You know, they don't want to, or sometimes even to, sometimes people won't say, if you ask them, for example, about their services or about the support that they get, they don't want to say anything negative because they might be afraid of losing their support or losing their service, or their staff members being cross with them later, which is rather sad to think about, but it is a reality in many cases. Difficulties with abstract concepts, memory issues, difficulties with following sequences of things that need to be done, availability, lack of availability of support and transport can sometimes be an issue, and interestingly, the influence of supporters and the views of those who are providing support. So sometimes the lack of support is an issue, and sometimes having supporters around while you're trying to involve people in research as participants can also be an issue. So those are a whole range of the things that we have to think about how to minimize and how to deal with when we plan research with people with learning disabilities and those who are autistic. You can't actually see it very well, but these slides are actually not white. The slides are a very light gray color, a bluey gray color, and most of our text is blue and a very dark gray rather than black. And actually the reality for that, the reason for that, is that over years people have told us that people with dyslexia, autistic people, people with ADHD have told us that that's easier for them to see and to read and to process. Okay. Because of the time, we're just going to talk about the Living in Fear project for Hannah. We'll leave the RAG stuff and people can get the slides and come back to me about information. But I'd really like to talk and let Alan say a little bit about his role in the Living in Fear project. Now, this is quite an old project now, but it was one of the first projects. It was funded by the Big Lottery Fund. And it was one of the first projects where we were really able to do what we felt was quite a good job in terms of trying to get people involved in a whole range of different ways. And the project was about finding out how many people had experienced hate crime or victimization in Medway. So we specifically focused on Medway, and we worked in partnership with an organization called Autism London and MCCH. We wanted to know what happened afterwards, and we wanted to know who helped them. Okay, those were the basic issues. We did focus groups with a range of different people you can see there. We did a survey for people with learning disabilities and those who were autistic. We did a survey with families or paid carers for those who couldn't do it themselves, for example. We did a survey for police officers in Kent and Medway. We did interviews with people who had experienced in-depth interviews. And we also had access to police records of criminal offences and looked at the incidences and what happened to people and how things were processed. So a huge, big project, but that in itself, I've given you the link at the end for the project if anybody's interested in the project itself. But the key thing I want us to talk about is how we tried to capture the views and experiences of as many people as possible, and what the role of our project advisors were. And Alan's going to say a little bit about that in a second. So we had a project steering group and 4 project advisors, and the project steering group was made up of our project advisors who were people with learning disabilities or who were autistic, and we had the steering group was co-chaired by the chief inspector of the police, Kent and Medway Police at the time, Andy Pritchard. But it also, and the group had on it representatives of families, families of particularly family carers from ethnic minorities in particular, because we felt that that might be a particular group, and also members from health and victim support, and a whole range of people, the Challenging Behaviour Foundation, and a range of different people. We had an easy read version of the survey. In fact, we had several versions of the survey. We ran drop-in sessions so people could receive support to complete the survey, because lots of people lived and didn't have anybody to support them at home. So they could come and help us they could come and we trained some students to provide support to complete the survey with them. We used videos and drawings all throughout a whole range of the things we did in the focus groups and in the steering groups, for example. And we also offer translations of all information sheets into the main languages in the local area. And so we allowed people to do that. So Allan is going to talk to us a little bit about his role as a project advisor. And Allan and I together have put together the slides. So Allan is going to just tell you a little bit about some of the things he did, but on the slide you can see a whole range of the things that the project advisors got involved in. So Allan, would you like to tell us a little bit about the role and what you did as a project advisor on the Living in Fear project?
Yeah, I was just helping out on the Living in Fear group with people with disabilities, all about sort of social awareness and mental health illness awareness, how to sort of combat this kind of issues when people get picked on feeling very vulnerable. Because I got picked on once as a person in my flat, so I had to help them to understand what's going on, because I was being picked on a long time ago, and I had numerous amounts of times the police coming around to do hate crime where I had to report it. So I became to be on the Living in Fear project to help to combat to help other people, to see what they're going through, and to help them try and change in different ways to find out how they could sort of better themselves to not get picked on in the same way like I did.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sorts of tasks you did, Allan. So one of the things I remember is that you and Kathy and Rob and actually Robert, the other Robert, took it in turns, didn't you, to co-chair?
Yes.
The steering group with Andy Pritchard, with our friendly policeman. Do you remember?
Yes, all right. Mm-hmm, yeah, I remember that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What else did you do? Do you remember, what else did you do in terms of telling people about the research and encouraging them to fill in the questionnaires, for example? Do you remember some of the things you did?
Yeah, we've helped out the questionnaires we did. Mm-hmm. I remember filling out, co-chairing some of the group meetings we had at the places like Rochester and various events we had. With Andrew Pritchard being there. But yeah, the questionnaires were sent out to everybody, to all the police. I had to put it all together with some help with someone called Lisa Richardson. She put them all into envelopes and stuck them all up and label them, dress them and all that, and send them all out to everybody. That's part of the project as well.
You did that, and you also, if I remember rightly, because it is quite a long time ago now, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I can't believe it's nearly 10 years since we started the project, but you all checked, didn't you? You read through all the letters that we wanted to send people, and you helped us to choose good pictures, didn't you, for helping people to understand what the project was about.
That's right.
And you tried out the questionnaires, didn't you? You tried to complete them to see if they were understandable.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to make sure they're all understandable, so everybody else could try and understand them as well, and check them all in case some people didn't understand them. They might need to be altered a little bit. Some of them need to be altered. Yeah. But yeah, we would go through quite a lot of them to make them so that they're more understandable with words and pictures.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also went and talked to lots of people at the police stations, didn't you? You talked to quite a few of the groups in the police stations. Yes, we went to the
Fourth Contact Control, that's over at Maidstone. They've got their own set-up police station, their own police station at headquarters there. And that was rather interesting, because we met the Chief Constable. He also had a son there who also got mental health problems of some kind or other. And he kind of understood the sort of things we're discussing about what we want to try and set across to the police. And they also showed us around the forced contact control, where apparently where people just ring in with their numerous kinds of problems, from not just domestic but any type of problems, if they're having some kind of being picked on or vulnerable and they need to speak to someone from the police to speak to, and they tell you which side of the room it goes to, because I mean this room is huge, you know, it's with tinted windows, and there's lots of people taking calls from all different sides of the room. It tells you sort of whereabouts your call will go to, so they know who's helping you out, not just any type of crimes, and people could understand it was what kind of crime it was and what kind of hate crime it was, so they understand what kind of people are dealing with you at that particular time.
Yeah,
that was interesting. Yeah. And we even held meetings at the police station in one of their big theatres as well. That was all to do with hate crime.
Yes, we had one of our, if you remember, we had one of our, we ran conferences that were, so we ran several different conferences at the end, and to share the findings, and Alan and the other project advisors were our MCs. They compared, basically, they introduced everybody and introduced all the speakers and at the conference, and we ran one of the conferences as an easy read or an easy understandable conference, so people with learning disabilities themselves could come, and the project advisors were really important in doing that. And then, Alan, the last thing, which I know it's one of your favorite things about the whole project, do you want to tell them very briefly a bit about Vienna?
Yeah, that was really interesting. That we got a chance to, because I think there was a selection who was going to Vienna, and it was me and Rob. We got a chance to go for about 2 or 3 days or so to hold a big conference over in one of their theatres, over their buildings at the college university, where they were set up with some workshops, and we could go to different types of workshops, and different little meetings were going on there. And we also put ours out, our Living in Fear, across the world of people who want to understand all about our project, what we're talking about. That was like over 2 or 3 days of being at Vienna, doing kind of sort of different conferences each day, and yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed that. That was one of my favourite pastimes. That was. Yeah.
So this, for those who won't be aware, this was the European Congress on Intellectual and Developmental Disability. So one of our big conferences, and they had 2 streams. They had the main academic stream and the inclusion stream. But actually, Alan and Rob were part of the main academic stream, and they not only presented, but they chaired, we chaired several symposiums together. So we co-chaired symposiums together in the main academic stream.
I can remember in some of those workshops, we actually co-chaired some of those. I think it was one of the meetings, Rob did one or 2 of them, and then there's another few meetings I did some as well, and then I co-chaired in comparison with, together with Rob as well. We did 2. It was like a joint meeting with me and Rob doing a meeting to some others that attended. It was like small meetings in each classrooms.
Yeah, so lots of parallel sessions, wasn't there? Lots of sessions running at the same time. Absolutely.
And of course, meeting people at these dinner dues, lunches, and all that sort of thing. They all met up with us, and we could talk more about what kind of work that we were sort of doing in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. So these were just a couple of the examples of this is a bit from the survey, for example, or from the information sheets, basically. So these were just some examples, and these were some of the pictures that Rob and the others that were involved help us to find and to choose, and to sometimes we had them specifically drawn for the purpose, for example, and they were all read. And the letter is in English, but we and this was actually translated into Punjabi, Urdu, Bengali, and Chinese at the front of every form, because those were the main language, those were the main additional languages in Medway. And so the actual form that went out to everybody had this in 4 languages, to say to people that if they needed a translated version of the form, they could do that. So, and some examples from the survey, so that you can see the sort of things, the work that they did, and how the group helped us to kind of develop these and test them over and over and over again until we got it relatively good for people to fill in. So I'm aware of the time for Hannah, and it would be good, I guess, if people had any questions from this point. I have a suggestion, which, and I'll talk, is that maybe Alan and I could make a video for the rest of the session, because we were obviously a bit late starting and then had a little break to try and get Alan to be able to join us. So if we could make a video, maybe we could make a video for the rest of it, and you could maybe join it together and put it on the put it on the website if people are interested in hearing a bit more about the project and a bit more about the RAG group, which is our Researching Altogether group at Tizard Centre.
That would be brilliant, Julie.
Would that be okay? I think that if we just maybe give people a couple of minutes, if there are any burning questions now, and if there are other questions later, I'm very happy. My email address will be on the handout. So if there are any burning questions now, we can certainly try and take those, and then we can follow up maybe afterwards if people have other questions. We've
probably got the chance for one question, because I've just been notified the group will finish in 2 minutes. So,
oh gosh, okay.
I apologise. That's very kind. Are there any questions from people? I'm just trying to look at any show of hands in the chat. I don't think, unless I've missed, I don't think there are any as yet. But if there aren't any questions, then I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Alan and Julie for that brilliant presentation. It's been so informative. I can't thank you enough. And it was really helpful to hear of Alan's experiences of being on the steering group and co-chairing and presenting at conferences, with Julie, you at the beginning, sort of setting the scene. So thank you very much. One question potentially. Okay, I think it's just a comment. Good guidelines, Julie. Thank you very much, Julie. And Alan.
Thank you, that's all right.
Okay, thank you. And I apologise that we didn't quite get it.
No, that's absolutely brilliant, and we'll follow up with
we'll do a video if people are interested, and then people can just contact us afterwards for questions. Okay, all right, thank you.